C. Dependency. Women seeking unemployment insurance would be particularly anxious to secure sufficient coverage to care for dependent children, and would seek some exemption from any work or training requirement during the late stages of pregnancy and while their children were very young. But insurers would worry that the availability of such insurance would itself increase pregnancy among those with low income. The suspicion that welfare is in good part responsible for increases in the number of teenage single parents was one of the prime political forces behind the welfare reform that ended the federally sponsored Aid for Families with Dependent Children program and stipulated that states cannot compensate single parents for more than 2 years. Many politicians declare such stringency necessary to break the cycle of dependencies that, they say, has made many teenagers indifferent to pregnancy and led some of them deliberately to seek it as a means of living in an unappealing home to establish an independent residence. But though the consequences of the reform are unlikely to include a significant drop in teenage pregnancy, they will almost certainly produce great harm to infant children, many of whom will be taken from their parents and put into foster care programs. If we follow the hypothetical insurance approach we have been exploring and try to design a welfare scheme by asking what insurance people would buy in the imagined community, and if we restrict our attention to the insurance that people facing a risk of unemployment might buy for themselves, we will reach a depressing conclusion. Insurance policies written for potential parents, providing coverage sufficient for raising a family as well as maintaining themselves, would be likely to contain a provision denying such coverage to unmarried or otherwise economically unqualified parents, placing on them the risk of neglected or unsuccessful contraception. If we modeled welfare provision in society on that insurance, welfare would be denied to many single parents who now receive it. The hypothetical insurance approach seems, at least in this instance, to endorse the austere strategy of the recent legislation. But that is a misunderstanding, because the hypothetical insurance approach is designed to serve the needs of an ethically sensitive theory of justice by making distribution sensitive to choice and conduct, and it must therefore not be used to condition distribution to one group, children, on the conduct of another, their parents. We must ask a different question. How much insurance would children buy? And on what terms, against being born to indigent and unemployed parents? We need not imagine fetuses negotiating insurance policies to try to answer that question. We can ask how much insurance, at what terms, would prudent guardians buy on their behalf, on the understanding that premiums were to be paid later, on some long-delayed installment plan, by the children themselves. It seems plain that a prudent guardian would buy insurance to provide enough coverage to allow an infant to live with its own parents, and to receive enough medical care and education to survive and qualify for employment when appropriate. Insurers would approach the design of such a policy statistically as they would any other form of health insurance, since they could not condition compensation on anyone's behavior without destroying the point of the insurance. They would be alive to the commercial importance of discouraging poor and unmarried women from becoming pregnant, however, and it would probably behoove them to set aside part of their profits for education campaigns, as insurers now do for information about smoking. They might also require, as a provision in the policy, that they be subordinated to an infant's legal rights against an absent parent. It might possibly act as some deterrence if insurance companies were to pursue absent fathers with paternity claims. D. Summary. The hypothetical insurance approach attempts to bracket a range of welfare programs that a reasonable person or legislature might think required by the twin principles that people's lives are of equal importance, and that each person has a responsibility to take control of his own life. The approach confirms a conviction that I believe a great many readers already have, that a welfare scheme with no cut-off that either may or must provide training and job assistance, and that conditions compensation on good faith endeavor to find employment, is preferable either to a more severe or a more generous program. If so, that is good news for the insurance approach and good news for that conviction, because each stands up for the other. Several states have in fact been pursuing such welfare schemes, though only as special pilot programs under waivers granted by the federal government. But the provisions of the new Welfare Reform Act do not fall within the range licensed by the insurance approach. They are modelled on the severe policy, and that policy would be distinctly unpopular among prudent insurers. The provisions that terminate poor parents' welfare after 2 years and so doom children to the bleakest poverty or to foster care are particularly deplorable. The hypothetical insurance approach, as we just saw, would condemn those provisions, not so much for supplying the wrong answer, but for posing the wrong question. 6. The luck of the draw. The conservative arguments I discussed earlier insist that the welfare schemes authorized by the hypothetical insurance device are too generous. We must now consider the deeper and more serious objection that, on the contrary, the device is too mean. Transfers modeled on hypothetical insurance will mitigate but by no means erase the inequality generated by unemployment, because no hypothetical prudent person would buy insurance that would guarantee him even the average wage of those in employment, let alone wages equal to those that the highest earners gather. The hypothetical insurance device, the new objection complains, makes too much still depend on luck. Those born with less wealth talent or into a background where wealth talent is less likely to be honed will have fewer resources throughout their lives, even after they receive the benefits that the insurance device would justify. We need, according to this complaint, a more thorough and radical welfare program. We need perhaps a welfare program that would fully satisfy the envy test discussed in Chapter 2 by making the resources that equally industrious people command over their lives equal no matter what native talent they are born with. There are a variety of conceptual difficulties in that last ambition, all described in Chapter 2, and the strategic problem we considered earlier in this chapter adds further difficulties, because any political program that aimed at making the income of the involuntarily unemployed equal to that of those who work would, in practice, inevitably and seriously violate the principle that distribution should be sensitive to choice. It is no more possible to erase all differences in wealth that derive from inequality in talent without also erasing some of those that derive from choice than it was for Shylock to take his pound of flesh without drawing a drop of blood. But we should set aside these various serious conceptual and practical difficulties now to focus on the underlying question of principle that the objection raises. Is the hypothetical insurance device defective because it undercompensates those who genuinely want work but are unable to find it? When I introduced that device in Chapter 2, I did so with reservations. I said that egalitarians could defend at least as much compensation as the device would recommend, but that we might hope to be able to find a different analytical tool that would justify greater compensation. The objection we are now considering provides an opportunity to return to those reservations. How far were they justified? The effects of the hypothetical insurance strategy is not to eliminate the consequences of brute bad luck that flows not from a gamble deliberately taken but from life itself, but only to mitigate it to the degree and in the way that prudent insurance normally does. The strategy aims to put people in an equal position with respect to risk, rather than to negate risk altogether. Does that aim show equal concern for all citizens, or does genuine equal concern require what I called in Chapter 8 a rescue approach, which would require the community to provide any medical treatment, no matter how speculative or expensive, that increases, no matter how marginally, a patient's life expectancy? I pointed out that no community could actually keep that promise without crippling itself. It would have to spend so much on medical care that it would have nothing left with which it might try to make the lives of its members, the unlucky as well as lucky, good as well as long. It is harder to stipulate what the rescue approach would require by way of compensation, not for illness but for unemployment. But it might be thought to require, for example, that anyone unemployed through no fault of his own should continue to receive his last wage in employment, adjusted from time to time for any inflation. The manifold costs to the community of that policy and the damage it would inflict on the community's economy would be very great. The insurance approach reflects a very different understanding of how a community with equal concern for all treats risk. That different conception seems clearly superior to the rescue approach in some contexts. Imagine a disabling disease that is in no degree either genetic or class biased, and that strikes people randomly but only after the age of 40, and suppose a community in which wealth is distributed fairly and all citizens are below that age. The insurance approach requires the community to afford to offer insurance against contracting the disease at market rates, either privately through commercial insurers or publicly through a state program, so that citizens can decide for themselves whether to buy such insurance and at what level of coverage. That approach is ex ante better for everyone, except perhaps citizens who are imprudent, than a rescue approach, because it gives each the choice as to how much future protection he wishes as against how much sacrifice, in the form of insurance premiums, he is willing and deems it right to make now, rather than forcing on him a collective decision that no one would make for himself. That policy seems the ideal way, at least in these circumstances, to show equal concern for all, but it does require that the community limit its help to those who do later contract the disease to the coverage they purchased, except perhaps for paternalistic aid to the very imprudent. If the community were to switch to something closer to the rescue approach when the first victim fell ill, it would then in effect have imposed on everyone, for the future, an insurance regime vastly more expensive than its citizens deemed it wise and appropriate to buy for themselves. Now imagine a different story. Suppose that the disease is in fact genetically skewed. People with a certain genetic structure are much more likely to contract it, but that no one, including himself, knows that any particular citizen has the dangerous genes until after the disease strikes. Now we must distinguish between subjective and objective interests. It is still in everyone's subjective interests, his interests so far as he or anyone else knows, that the community choose the insurance rather than a rescue approach, but not, or at least not equally, in everyone's objective interests. Why, however, should that make a difference? Why should it matter when fate intervenes in our lives? There seems no difference in the justice of the matter, whether bad luck falls on us a moment after the insurance decision is made, or whether it has already fallen on us, unawares, at some earlier time. There are varieties of poker in which players bet on cards they have been dealt but have not seen, and these are no less fair than games in which they bet on cards to come. So the insurance approach still seems fair even when the story is changed in this way. The community treats people with equal concern when it allows them all to insure on the same terms and at the level of coverage each chooses, even when the bad luck against which they insure has already secretly struck. Now change the story again. Imagine now that the genetic information needed to predict who will develop the disease is easily available, so that everyone knows who the victims will be. Indeed, suppose that some of the victims have already developed the disease when the community first begins to consider what policy of compensation it will follow. There is now no possibility of an ordinary insurance market against the disease. Even if insurers offered policies on the same terms to everyone, only people who knew they were at risk would buy it, and insurers would go bankrupt unless they charged premiums so high that the insurance would be useless to future victims. But government can nevertheless follow the hypothetical insurance device. It can in that way transform the story so that it becomes, counterfactually, like the first two stories we considered. Government can pay those who contract the disease, or those who have already done so, in accordance with policies it seemed reasonable to assume most people would have bought in the first or second stories. Would the insurance approach, understood in that counterfactual way, be less appropriate, less a display of equal concern for everyone in this case than in the others? There are two pertinent differences between the first two stories and this third one. In the first two stories, government makes its initial decision to pursue an insurance approach rather than a rescue one when no citizen can complain that the opposite decision would be more in his favor. In the third story, on the other hand, some citizens can make that charge whenever government's initial decision is made. In the first two stories, moreover, individual citizens themselves decide whether to insure and for how much. The decision as to which risks are worth running is theirs. In the third story, however, government must make that decision collectively for everyone, and some victims may insist that they would have insured for more if they had had the chance to make the decision themselves. The first of these two differences might seem the more important, but it is in fact illusory, because any political decision once made is constantly remade. Once the first victim developed the disease, in the first story, it was open to the community to change its mind and to adopt the rescue policy on his behalf. and the community's decision not to do that, in the face of his then identifiable special needs, was a fresh decision needing a fresh justification. True, any victim in the first story would already have had the benefit of the insurance approach before he fell ill. He would have profited from the expenditures the community was able to make on education, job-producing capital investment, and the rest of what it could do because it was not setting money aside to finance the rescue approach. But that is also true in the third story, because even those who are doomed from birth nevertheless share the benefits of communal expenditures that would not have been made if a rescue approach had been established long ago. It may well be that a victim in the third story would have been better off, all things considered, if the rescue approach had been adopted, say, just before his birth. But that may also be true for a victim in the first story, as things turned out for him. Just as the difference in the moment of objective vulnerability makes no difference in what justice requires when we move from the first to the second story, so the difference in subjective vulnerability should make no difference in what justice requires when we move from the second to the third. The insurance approach makes sense only if we treat it as the standing policy of a community into which individuals enter. It ensures them against bad luck, even when they bring that bad luck into the world with themselves. The other difference I mentioned, that in the third story citizens do not make the pertinent insurance decisions for themselves, is more important. It is a great strength of the insurance approach in the first two stories, as against the rescue one, that it allows people to make decisions about the relative importance of various risks for themselves, so that they can tailor their use of their own resources to their own judgments, ambitions, tastes, convictions, and commitments. That makes the insurance policy both more egalitarian and more liberal than the rescue policy in those two stories. The approach illustrates the central claim of this book by serving equality and liberty together. In the third story, however, it is not possible for people to make the judgment for themselves. The community must make it for them. It does so in a counterfactual spirit, attempting to recapitulate what they are likely to have decided for themselves if they did have that opportunity. In practice, however, that cannot be a matter of individualized psychology. How could we decide what a particular individual who has carried knowledge of his vulnerability all his life would have decided about insurance if he had not had that knowledge? A community that adopts the insurance understanding of equal concern must treat the counterfactual question as statistical rather than individualized. It must ask roughly what level of coverage against risks of the character in question would seem reasonable to the majority of people in the community, or to the average person, or something of that sort, given the likely premium structure and given most people's needs, tastes, and ambitions. Judgment is required to answer even so loose a question, of course, and different citizens and officials would answer it somewhat differently. But their answers would almost all fall within a certain range. The average person would insist on some insurance, enough to provide medicine that could reliably be expected to cure the disease or sharply mitigate its consequences, for example, but would not purchase a rescue policy that would provide coverage for highly speculative or marginal treatment, because the cost of a rescue policy would mean that his life would be crippled even if he never contracted the disease. Of course, no matter what counterfactual judgments the community makes about what an average person would have done, someone born with the disease or with a genetic propensity toward it might well believe that he would have bought more coverage than that, even if he were ignorant of his affliction. But he could hardly argue that he would have bought anything approaching a rescue policy, and, given the impossibility of establishing what coverage less than that but greater than the supposed average coverage he would have bought, it seems fair enough to ask him to be satisfied with the latter. The main subject of this chapter is not disease, however, but unemployment, and there is an important difference between the two topics. While it seems right to suppose that illness, even when it has a genetic base, is a matter of bad luck, that does not seem entirely right in the case of unemployment. Genetic luck does play a role in fixing how likely someone is to find a desirable job, since wealth talents are in some measure, and perhaps in a large measure, innate. But class and prejudice are matters of injustice, not luck, and they also play an important role in the distribution of jobs and income in modern democracies. For the purpose of our analysis, however, we must try to separate these two factors, luck and injustice. If the central features of equality of resources were realized, then class would disappear, at least over time. If proper civil rights laws were enacted and enforced, the influence of prejudice on employment would wane, There is much less systematic discrimination against women and minorities in the workplace in the United States now, 3 decades after discrimination in employment was outlawed, than before that legislation. The objection to the insurance approach that we are now considering is broader and would still be pertinent even if class and prejudice were no longer significant, for it would still be true that some citizens were unemployed or employed at a relatively low wage through no fault of their own, but only because they lacked the pertinent talent or were not in the right place at the right time. That is their bad luck, and the argument we just outlined for an insurance rather than the rescue policy in the case of disease applies with equal force to unemployment for those reasons. The objection that we have been considering in this section, that the insurance approach fails to show equal concern, is understandable but wrong. 7. Luck, class, and generation. I must now say something about why equality of resources would not generate class distinctions. For reasons we have already noticed, that conception of equality would not equalize citizens' in personal resources over time. Some people will earn more than others through their choices for higher paying jobs or for more work and less leisure, or through investment gambles that prosper rather than disappoint. The insurance device that we have been studying, moreover, aims to make people equal in their ex-ante risk of bad luck, but not in their ex-post circumstances once bad luck strikes. So as time passes, some citizens will grow richer than others. Income taxes modeled on hypothetical insurance and used to compensate the unemployed and others who have suffered from rude bad luck will make differences in income and wealth much less striking than they are in the United States and other mature economies now. But nevertheless, some citizens will accumulate more wealth than others, and if they are free to pass on their greater wealth to their children, either by gift during their lives or by bequest, the differences will tend to increase and to take on the familiar character of a class system. What legitimate policy could prevent that? Many nations impose capital transfer taxes on gifts and bequests, and these have often been steep and highly progressive, in some cases approaching 100% at the margin of a wealthy dissident's estate, though the trend in many nations has been toward lower capital transfer taxes in recent years. But it is not immediately clear that these taxes are justified under equality of resources, and if they are, at what level. If income taxes modeled on hypothetical unemployment insurance have been enacted and are enforced, and if the proceeds of that taxation are redistributed to victims who could claim under that hypothetical insurance, then no citizen has an unjustly large income after taxes. If so, then citizens are morally free to spend their wealth as they wish, on expensive cars or art or travel, for example, without incurring further taxes. Why should they be unable to spend their wealth free of further taxes in one specific way, giving it away while alive or after death, in accordance with their wishes? We want to say people may be taxed on what they give or leave to others because this one form of expenditure, unlike all others, produces injustice in the next generation. But we must take care to specify what that injustice is and why an inheritance or other form of capital transfer tax is the right remedy for it. It is a ruling principle of equality, we have decided, that it is unjust when some people lead their lives with less wealth available to them, or in otherwise less favorable circumstances than others, not through some choice or gamble of their own, but through brute bad luck. It is bad luck to be born into a relatively poor family or a family that is selfish or spendthrift. We need not fantasize to adopt that idea that people enjoy some ghostly pre-existence before they are conceived, and that some such speculative persons have the good fortune to be conceived by industrious, lucky, and generous parents, while others the bad luck to be conceived by poor or unlucky or selfish ones. For we have been treating genetic structure as a matter of luck, the luck, good or bad, that people bring into the world with them, as we must if we accept the common sense view that handicaps of various kinds are a misfortune. Luck, for purposes of our analysis, includes what might be thought to be matters of identity as well as accidents that happen once identity is fixed, and the situation and properties of one's parents or relatives are as much a matter of luck in that sense as one's own as one's own physical powers. If inheritance is, for our purposes, a matter of luck, then we can justify inheritance and other capital transfer taxes in the now familiar way. In a more nearly equal world, people would be able to insure against bad inheritance luck as much as against bad genetic luck, and we may therefore justify such taxes and fix the band of their acceptable levels by constructing another hypothetical insurance market in which hypothetical people may all buy such insurance on equal terms. Just as we imagine guardians contracting for handicap and unemployment insurance on behalf of people yet to be born, so we can imagine guardians contracting for insurance against their charges having the bad luck to be born to parents who can give or will leave them relatively little. It is more difficult, however, to specify the properties of a hypothetical market in inheritance insurance. We should begin by asking why people would want such insurance and what considerations would affect how much they would be willing to pay for it. The harm such insurance protects against is, we might say, relative rather than absolute. We assume that people have decided how much health and unemployment insurance to buy. They have decided, let us assume, that it makes sense to provide for helpful but not speculative medical care and for income, if unemployed, somewhat above the poverty line in their community. They have decided that further insurance to guarantee more medical care or a higher income would not be worth its premium cost. Inheritance insurance would make sense, therefore, to guarantee not a higher standard of living in absolute terms, but against the different and distinct harm of occupying a low tier in a class system, against, that is, a life in a community where others have much more money and consequently more status and power than they do and their children will. But it does not make sense for them to pay premiums out of current income to guard against that relative disadvantage, because, as I just said, they have already decided that spending more to guarantee a higher absolute income would be unwise. We can now see why an inheritance tax, at a steeply progressive rate, seems a natural response to the problem. In this case, we work back from the properties of a familiar tax to the structure of a hypothetical insurance market that would justify that tax to test whether that structure is plausible. We construct a hypothetical market in which no premiums are due until the insured dies or makes a voluntary gift. Any premiums then due are measured by the assets given or bequeathed, and the premium rate rises steeply from zero in the case of modest gifts or a modest estate to a very high marginal proportion of very great wealth. That structure allows someone to insure with no premium impact on his own life, that is, no sacrifice in his goals or ambitions for himself and for those, including his spouse, for whom gifts or bequests are normally premium-free. Of course, most people care about their children's welfare, often more than they care about their own, and they want to save and even sacrifice, if necessary, for their children. But that motive is double-edged. It provides someone with some reason for not wanting the premiums on inheritance insurance, when these finally fall due, to exhaust all assets remaining at death. But it also provides a strong reason for ensuring that they themselves will have a fairly equal start in their own lives, that they will not begin handicapped by their own parents' failure or bad luck in their desire to make a good life for themselves, and therefore for the children as well. In any case, a steeply progressive premium schedule would assure them that their own work and success would benefit their children. The only sacrifice they would risk by insuring at a high progressive premium would be an inability to make their children very much richer than their contemporaries. So the character of familiar inheritance taxes does suggest a hypothetical insurance market that is counterfactually plausible. The most plausible form of that market, moreover, in turn suggests the more concrete form that inheritance taxation should take. It suggests that inheritance taxes should be both progressive and at a high enough level to protect against economic stratification. That is, after all, the point of the insurance. In many countries, inheritance taxes have decreased from historically high levels, and our analysis shows that this decrease, however popular politically, may well be unjust. Our exercise also suggests how government should spend the money raised from gift and inheritance taxation. It should not use those funds to pay for the medical and unemployment benefits that, on our analysis, it falls to income taxes to finance. Government should rather use the proceeds of inheritance tax for improved public education, education and training loans for would-be professionals, and other programs that ease the impact of whatever economic stratification remains after the tax has been levied. 8. Insurance and utility. It remains to emphasize, as a caution against misunderstandings, that though the conception of equal concern developed in this chapter does emphasize the ex-ante benefits of the insurance approach, it does not transform equality of resources into any form of welfarism, including utilitarianism. A community that followed the insurance approach to the various problems we have been discussing would indeed secure greater collective welfare, on any conception of welfare we might choose, than one that tried to follow a rescue approach. But the point of the strategy is fairness to individuals rather than any collective goal, and in the result is very unlikely to match what programs designed to maximize collective utility would recommend. A utilitarian would find it unreasonable to stipulate that taxes for redistribution should mimic an insurance market in which each individual is offered insurance at parallel rates. Differences in objective and subjective risk among actual people would be of prime importance in any utilitarian calculation, but of no importance for equal concern as we have now understood it. À tout de suite. Je reviens.